Hi, I'm Diane Steepro, and this is the Jeffersonville Township Public Library's program, uh, Pandemic and Protest Oral History Project Wrap-Up. So we're having a discussion tonight with some of the people who participated in one capacity or another in the project. Dr. Tracy K'Meyer will be moderating, and she also served as our project advisor and kept us on the straight and narrow and taught us a bit about how to do oral history. We'll also be talking to Larry Basham, an area resident, Reverend Karen Barth, also an area resident, Eden Quillenschmidt, also an area resident, and she both worked on the project and gave an interview. And with that, no further ado, I will turn you over to Dr. K'Meyer.
Hey, hello, everybody. Thanks for dialing in, I guess. I'd like to start with a couple questions for the staff of the project, sort of to lay the groundwork, let everyone who watches know sort of where this came from. So the staff, the people, I guess that's mostly you, Diane, but also Eden. Can you tell me how this project came to be?
Well, first of all, this is funded by the American Rescue Plan Act through Indiana Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And when I saw that a grant was available to do work in the humanities related to COVID, I started thinking about what this area really needed. I contacted you and bounced some ideas off of you. And I guess it seemed like the thing that this area really needed to record was how the pandemic and the protests of the Breonna Taylor killing that unfolded right in the worst of the really what was the most disruptive part of the pandemic, the early part when we were locked down and nobody really knew what was happening yet. And we had these two great big mysteries. What happened that caused this woman to die, and horribly, and how did that unfold? And then how are we going to get through this pandemic? So it seemed like something to talk to people about. And, obviously a lot of it was going to unfold before we were able to do the recording. But my goals for the project were to talk to as broad a group of people as possible, and to just record people's experiences with those two really earth-shaking events that happened here, and with and their experiences with also the information that they were getting about those events, because I thought the information was really important, because we're seeing so much misinformation now.
Right. And I thought that what I'd like to do is ask some people some questions about the pandemic, and then the protests, and then some sort of evaluation questions that bring them together, or we can sort of talk about how they come together. So wanted to start with the pandemic experiences. And now, during your interviews, you each raised some interesting stories, interesting questions, but of course, most people won't see those whole interviews. So I'd like to get to ask questions about some of the things you talked about during your interview, see if you could sort of elaborate on them, or speak to this audience a little bit about them. I'd like to start with Mr. Basham. One of the things I found interesting in your interview was you talked about having a hunch or predicting to your daughter that something like the pandemic might happen. So can you tell us that story, and maybe elaborate a little bit on how you learned about COVID and its spread, how you first heard about it?
Absolutely. I told my daughter that I had a feeling that the next major calamity that mankind might have to deal with might be a pandemic of some kind. One of the things that sort of triggered this, and this is what, 10, 15, 20 years ago, was that at the time we were living in California, and I was going to the University of Southern California for filmmaking at the time. And so I would pay attention to any stories that came up regarding University of Southern California and other universities in the area, just trying to keep abreast of what was going on. And then one day I saw something about a scientist who was experimenting with, some sort of genetic material,
Mm-hmm.
in which he just flushed it down the drain. At least that was what was reported. And it made me start thinking, wow, if that stuff goes down the drain, what's going to happen down the road? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Be some problems. And I just started, it was just in the back of my mind for a long time. So I was telling my daughter one day about how it was so important that whatever we ate, we made sure that we didn't pick up something off the ground and eat it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, always wash our hands, things like that, because who knows where that abnormal genetic material might wind up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I told her that one of the reasons why we always want to be extremely careful, because the next major thing could be a major, what I call was a biological imperative.
Mm-hmm.
And those are my words, biological imperative. And that might be even more, I'd say, something that we might have a greater expectation might happen than, let's say, a nuclear holocaust, or let's face it, an alien holocaust,
Right.
or something, the Yellowstone blowing up, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I used to tell her a lot of things, and I didn't hold anything back, because she'd ask me a question, I give her a regular answer. I give her a regular answer about it. And most times she might ask a couple of questions, but she could get it. Somehow she understood it. Of course, she's a very smart, young woman. And well, when this thing came out with the pandemic, well, it wasn't a pandemic yet. They were talking about COVID, and I'd seen some things, but having seen things on other kinds of diseases, and they all kind of just came through. Yeah, it was kind of a bit of a scare, but it never really made it to America. It was never really a big problem for us. So
Mm-hmm.
in this thing with C-19, which was China and maybe a few other countries, and I didn't really take it that seriously in respect that it might reach here. And so I just, well, it probably won't get to us.
Mm-hmm.
Not going to be a big deal like the others, like I'd say Ebola or something like that.
Right.
But in any case, my daughter called me one day and she says, "Daddy, did you hear about this C-19 thing?" I said, "Yeah, I heard about it." She says, "Well, Daddy, I think this is really serious. You really need to go out and, buy this and buy that and buy masks and gloves and do this and do that." And I said, "What's this all about?" She says, "Well, I just remember back when you told me that this next major thing that might be happening might be some biological thing. I think this is it." And I said, well, well, whatever, it is. I was trying to, just appease her a little bit, because she is my only child.
Uh-huh.
Said, "Yeah, okay, yeah, sure, yeah, we'll go buy some, sure. We'll go get some masks and stuff, yeah." But I'm thinking, yeah, it's not that big of a deal.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, it really turned out to be a really big deal.
Yeah.
But had she not called me, and after she called, I became hyper vigilant about protective measures and everything, because every few days or weeks he would call us talking about it. You wearing your mask, wearing your gloves, you guys getting everything from the store that you need, you got a stockpile. And yeah, sure, yeah, we'll go get some of that stuff tomorrow. Yeah, we'll do it, sure.
Yeah.
And but had she not called and kept us, I mean, fully aware of it, whether we wanted to be aware of it at that time or not, it might have been a whole different story.
Right. So I always said at the beginning, it helps to have been someone who read a lot of science fiction novels,
Yes.
which I had done. So I was on it. You know, I recognize the signs from the science fiction novels.
That's great.
I think it's also a good lesson in listening to Dad. This is the lesson.
And listening to your kids.
You're listening to your kids, right? Yeah. I want to sort of segue into something that Eden had talked a lot about in her interview. And Eden, how do you say your last name?
Basham. Basham.
Oh, no, I mean, Eden, switching to Eden.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah. How do you say, is it?
Kuhlenschmidt.
Kuhlenschmidt.
Yeah.
So you talked a lot, that's a good segue from his story into something you talked a lot about in your interview, which was about some of the COVID mitigation procedures that you witness, and how people sort of were responding and how people were trying to take care of themselves. Can you fill in that part of the story for us a little bit?
After the first year, my sister was nearing retirement and things were getting somewhat better. And so we scheduled a trip to Hawaii, planning out how to best protect ourselves. And we made the trip, and it was really eye-opening to me how the Hawaiian state had bought into self-protection and community protection in a way that our area hadn't. In part, Hawaii has only one trauma one hospital on all the islands. And so they were very conscious from the beginning they could not overrun that hospital. And you would get on, they limited people on elevators. Here, there was no limit on getting on an elevator. You'd still have your 10 to 15 if you went out, which I rarely did. And if I'd see a full elevator, I wouldn't get on. But in Hawaii, they'd ask for just your party to be on the elevator or two parties. And I was walking from our room to the elevator and I hadn't quite put my mask on, and the door opened. And a little girl looked up and said, "Mommy, she doesn't have her face on yet," meaning I hadn't had my mask on. So buy-in, even from the youngest, all the stores had hand sanitizer. You had to use it before you went in and out. I never saw any stores offering hand sanitizers. In Hawaii, a number of the chain stores gave you a bottle of hand sanitizer as part of your purchase, free. You know, I think one of the graphic things was we'd been watching on Reddit the anti-vax movement. And in Hilo, there had always been protesters on the days of the farmer market. And it started out with a huge crowd, several hundred. And Hilo is maybe a little bit bigger than Jeff in population. And when we got there, 6 to 8 months after the protests started on Wednesdays, and we went, I looked around and I didn't see any protesters. And so I asked the vendor, "Isn't this where the protesters are?" And she said, "Well, they were." And I said, "What happened? Did they give up the ghost and get vaccinated?" She said, "No, they all died." And I was like, and she said, "Yeah, they all got COVID and died." And she says, what's worse was there was a village wedding 3 months after COVID hit the islands. And as a result, 5,000 people died between two villages and a wedding. And at that time, people, that's when they had their the most number of people getting vaccinations, because they knew what had happened in these two very small mountain communities. And so I could see the buy-in there. And we came back, the Honolulu airport they didn't just have one seat blocked off between where you sat. They had 2 or 3 seats. There was space. They were constantly cleaning the restrooms. We got to the Minneapolis airport. People weren't wearing masks. We went into the one lounge. Nobody was cleaning up in the same way. We got to Nashville. Now, people in Nashville were wearing their masks, and they did have seats blocked off. I have that to say for them. But we came back in a rental car, and we had another party with us, and we were wearing our masks then. So I came home and people were starting to loosen up wearing their masks. I didn't see quite the same distance from sitting from each other. And I have to say, on the airplane, they really did try to help people be isolated from each other. But I came back, and after being in Hawaii, it was just kind of disappointing. It was like, you're in my space, which had doubled over as a result of COVID, And I think it was another 3 months after that, or 4 months, even though we had started having church in person, I didn't go back until I think it was like April or May, because I need to stay away from people. I probably do a COVID test more frequently than other persons. COVID has changed a lot of my actions. I go to the grocery store the day of the week that it's least shopped. I go at hours where there will be minimum persons there, or I will order and do pickup. It changed my relationship with Diane in the library. It used to be I'd be in volunteering 2 to 3 days a week. Now I do almost all my volunteer work from home, and I will run into her with updates once a month. And we're usually wearing masks then, even now, and particularly with, COVID returning again. So that trip really ran home to me the importance of personal responsibility in taking care of yourself in illness, and personal responsibility in helping take care of your community in illness. So.
And isn't it interesting? It'll be very interesting eventually, because there's oral history projects like this going on all around the country, right, to really look at interviews from different places and look at the comparison in terms of impact and stuff.
Right. I want to say I want to say one other thing.
Okay.
You had written down a question of how people were selected for interview, and Diane didn't talk about that.
Yeah.
When she was working on this grant, we started brainstorming. She and I think we had a couple of other people. The healthcare industry workers were taken care of in another grant, but we have a different oral history thing. So one of our goals was we wanted people who worked with students. We were hoping to get people in the news profession. I suggested Pastor Barth because I knew the churches had undergone incredible strain, because they were having to deal with not just the physical burden of COVID, but the mental health needs and the emotions of their congregation, and the financial needs. And I think she'll probably talk about that in a minute.
We're going to ask her next.
So
get ready.
And I wanted somebody to speak to, or we wanted somebody who would speak to working with youth, because the COVID devastated scouting movements and after school sports and choir and all those things. And so we had a couple who work in scouting who were interviewed for the project, and then teachers and a few other people. So we brainstormed kind of the occupational areas that we wanted, and then we started putting names and faces and starting asking folks.
Right.
The interviewers split up who they asked.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of projects that are focusing not just here locally, but around the country on different. I have been advising someone who's interviewing what she calls the last responders. She's interviewing funeral home staff.
Oh.
About it. So, but you did sort of wind up the pitch to Reverend Barth. And so I'd like to turn to you and ask you, we know that COVID had a very large impact on all kinds of institutions and communities. Can you describe a little bit how it affected your churches, because over the time you worked with two, and your congregation, and the way you work? You're muted. Can't.
Thank you. The first congregation I was serving was a very small congregation in Louisville, and it had already made the decision to bring its ministry to a close in January of 2020. It made that decision. So right before COVID hit, it made that decision. And then in March, we made the decision to close in May of 2020. So we transitioned to Zoom for the last 2 months of that ministry, and had a closing worship with 60 people. We were down to about 6 people in the congregation, and we had a closing worship with 60 people on it via Zoom. That was quite a celebration, actually, even with Zoom. And of course, people wouldn't have been able to come if it hadn't been for Zoom. So that little congregation came to a close, and personally gave me 3 months sabbatical at the end of that ministry. And so I had time to kind of collect my wits and actually be home during the pandemic. I had also been a career-long massage therapist and massage therapy educator, and did that for 36 years. My practice was very small, and when COVID hit, that was it for me. I never quite thought I would retire completely from that profession, but when COVID hit, the requirements of what was needed and trying to maintain an office, it no longer was viable for me, and so I suspended that as well. So then St. Luke's congregation, which I now serve, in the middle of the pandemic, their pastor, the pastor previous to me, got an unexpected adoption opportunity. She was already raising one child, and then overnight got a foundling adoption and took maternity leave. And during that maternity leave time, decided that she was not going to return to pastor the congregation. So St. Luke's kind of had a double whammy in that the pandemic shut down everything in person, and then the pastor was also not there. So they did get some grant money during that time to set up remote worship. Got camera and technology set up to be able to do worship and do that remotely. And so they did that for a time. This was before I got there, and then came back in person. And then the next surge in the fall shut them down again. They called me in February of 2021. So I began with them as things were starting to ease some. Mm-hmm. And we opened up back in person on Palm Sunday of 2021. Mm-hmm. Now, it just so happened that on the Friday before Palm Sunday, my husband got his second vaccination and then had a heart attack the next day. And so we don't know that the vaccine had anything to do with that, but we also don't know that it didn't. And we are in favor of people getting vaccinated and vaccinated and boosted, but that has just given us a little bit of pause, because some of his symptoms during the care he was getting were not usual. Mm-hmm. And so we don't know whether the vaccine affected his process or not. So I was called as designated interim. In the midst of all the COVID questions, the congregation was not quite sure whether people were going to come back, what money was going to be like, whether they were going to be able to support a permanent pastor. And so I was called at 2/3 time as a 2/3 time interim. And then it went very well for me and the congregation, I think, over time. And by the end of the year, we knew that the congregation knew that they wanted to call me to a settled permanent position. Mm-hmm. And so I began that in January of this year at 3/4 time. Money has been affected. Donations have been affected. And many of the people that left during pandemic, there were two things for this particular church. One was the pastor leaving, and some people just getting disaffected at that point, and whether or not they will return is still a question. And the other is all the people who still need to protect themselves. And then some of it is habit. People have gotten used to not necessarily getting up on Sunday morning and coming to church. But our numbers are climbing back slowly but steadily. We have new members coming. I think we've lost about the same number of members to death that we have gained in new membership. So we're sort of holding steady. And people are pretty much comfortable coming to worship because it is still smaller and we still have lots of social distance capability. But we have returned to full choir participation. People in general are not masking. Some people do. And then for myself, if I'm with somebody who's masking, I try to mask. Right. So that, if they are at risk, I am not putting them at any more risk. I used to test a lot, and I have not kind of done that so much lately. I sort of feel like I know my level of wellness, and if I start to feel unwell, then I test. But so far, I've not contracted the virus.
Knocking on wood there.
I want to say one other thing just personally too. When, the information started to come out about COVID-19, and I started hearing that phrase and reading news stories a little bit. But then when I started looking a little deeper into what it was, and I saw that it was a SARS virus, then I kind of had, that feeling we are definitely in for, I don't know what to call it exactly, but that this is going to be really bad,
A rough ride.
Yeah.
Tracy, if I can interrupt, there's one thing that we actually did not get to in the regular interviews, but if Karen could talk about our Saturday meal for anyone who's in need of food and how COVID affected that. I think that's a little piece that we missed in the regular interviews.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important piece. That one of the major ministries of St. Luke's and of Jeffersonville is the Saturday meal called Loaves and Fishes, which is served out of St. Luke's every Saturday by a different church or community organization. There are about eight or nine organizations involved. And so there's a board that oversees that, and with members from the different churches and community organizations. And then pre-COVID, I think we were serving about 150 people every week. Is that accurate? And it was a full come inside, sit down meal, no questions asked. Whoever wanted to come and have a meal was welcome to come and have a meal. And so there was a lot of community building around that as well. Well, COVID changed that to an out the door serving of the meal. We're now serving, it's built back a little bit. It had gotten down to about 20 meals, but now we're serving about 50 meals a week, but still out the door, as the Loaves and Fishes board has not yet felt comfortable with bringing people back into the building on that large of a scale for a sit down meal.
Yeah.
So, but we continue to talk about, how we can serve people there's a little clothes pantry that goes along with that, and how we can make those things available to people. And we're hopeful at some point that the board will look again at that in October and see whether they're ready to have people back in the building.
Okay, I have like a sort of a general question for anybody who wants to jump in on this before we move to different topics. One of the things, well, actually, let me save the evaluation question to the end, because I do want to make sure we get in the questions about the protest movement. And I have a question both for Larry and for Karen that are that came up out of your interviews. So I'll start with Larry because it's chronologically earlier. But during your interview, so we're switching to talking about the Breonna Taylor protests and the response to that. So Mr. Basham, during your interview, you shared a little bit about your about the history of police violence and harassment, and even a little of your own experience with that. Do you mind sharing that story? A little, you know, sort of maybe a short version of it. But
I don't mind at all.
okay.
In the Black community, it is known that Black men, and I'm sure Black women, and especially Black men, have always been considered to be a threat to, I think, what a lot of policemen consider to be the status quo. And a lot of times assumptions are made about Black men and Black teenagers and young men as well, regarding whether or not they are a savory character or an unsavory character who is about to do no good or up to do no good, or isn't really doing the surrounding community any credit by being there, or wherever it is. And I'll just give a few examples in my life. One time I was in college, and a friend of mine lived in Chicago. And he was a musician, and I think he came from a middle class, or maybe upper middle class, or Black standards, Black family. And he lived way on the other side of town from where I had to get off at the bus station. So the Greyhound bus station. So I was trying to find my way to his house. And I was going to try to take buses. I didn't have enough money for a cab to go all the way, so walk if I had to. And I didn't really know the city that well. Well, it turned out that a lot of the buses had quit running. It was late. And so I was walking with my backpack. And this was during one of the breaks from college. And as I was walking down the street, a no, it wasn't a police car. It was just a plain sedan. And it was a four-door. And the two doors toward the sidewalk where I was walking, both opened at the same time. And in there was 4 white men, all with guns in their laps. And they fanned the guns, told me to get in. It was dark. I looked around. There was nothing around. There was nobody around. It was just me and them. And the fact they had their guns out and was fanning for me to get in, I had a feeling if I didn't get in, I probably wouldn't have survived that night. And it was doubtful I might survive even if I did get in. But I knew if I didn't, I definitely would not survive. So they made me get in, and I was sitting between two of them, both had guns. And they started saying, where are you going? And I said, oh, I'm just going to.
Uh-oh. I think there might be a technical glitch.
Yeah, Larry, I think you froze. If you could maybe exit and come back. Oof.
Such a good story.
Yeah.
Such a terrible story.
Such a terrible time for the glitch too.
Right. Well, if you could write him, Diane, while I
Yeah,
maybe
yeah, I'll
wait,
text
is he
him.
come right back? Wait a minute. Is he coming right back?
Larry.
I think.
Yeah, you're back. Okay.
Okay.
So
So
we lost you when they were asking you, you were explaining to them where you were going.
Yeah, and I said I was going to visit my friend. And he said, what's your friend's name? And I said, Tom Brown. By the way, he could be that famous jazz musician, rock musician, Tom Brown now. I'm just saying. But in any case, I was on my way to his house. And I said, well, he said, when he lives way over there, where you been? I said, well, I just got out of college. And well, we're on a break from college. I'm not thoroughly out of college. I was just going to try to see him for a little bit, maybe stay the night at his house. And so they asked me a whole bunch of questions about college and everything and this and that. And they said, well, we just want to make sure you're all right. You're a college kid. I said, yeah. Said, you're on the way to go see a friend. I said, yeah. Okay. We'll let you out. I said, could you give me a ride to his house? No. But you walk down 20 blocks, so you'll get there. I said, okay. I got out and I was so thankful that everything had went positive. Had I not been from a college or, had somebody I was going to go see, let's say I just happened to be walking to the grocery store or something,
Right.
then it would have been very, very bad. And with regard to that, that brings to mind another story. One time I lived in Louisville, actually, and I lived down off of 44th Street. I lived on 44th, and I was on my way from 44th to 44th and Broadway, which is like a block, like a him.
Mm-hmm.
And it was early in the morning because my girlfriend at the time, I think, wanted eggs and bacon or something, and I got up early to go get the eggs and bacon from the local grocery store. So I was on my way up to the store walking. It was a beautiful morning. And then all of a sudden, a police car pulls up. Police all jump out, surround me, guns out. Where are you going? What are you doing? And I said, I'm just on my way up to the grocery store. Where you been? Well, I just left my apartment. Well, we don't know. Something's happened, and you meet the description. And I said, what description is that? Black hair, brown eyes, and black. I said, wait a minute. Black hair, brown eyes, black I mean, about anybody,
Right.
you fit the description, get in. They started pushing me into the car because I knew that once they got me in the car and they took me downtown, there's no telling what might have happened. No telling. So I didn't want to go that route, because if they start thinking you're guilty, chances are in the end, somehow the system is going to find you guilty.
Right.
So, wait a minute, lieutenant's coming. He'll know what to do. So here came the lieutenant in a couple of minutes. And he jumped, and he came out of the car. And the lieutenant was a black lieutenant. He's middle-aged. And I was just saying, boy, I'm glad he's here. So he walked around me, looked at me again. You know, and I said, yeah, I was just on my way to the grocery store, get some groceries. And the lieutenant looked at me and he said, that's him, book him. I said, what? That's him, book him. And they started trying to force me back into the car. And I said, wait a minute, man, hold on. So they were just about got me pushed into the car. About then, a call came on the radio. Suspect apprehended. Suspect apprehended.
Wow.
They let me go. But it taught me it's not always a matter of black and white. It's the matter of the system.
Mm-hmm.
The system who teaches the officers, the administrators, or whatever, what to expect. So when they see a black man, they expect a lot of times that you will be the one that they're looking for if something has gone wrong.
Right.
Chances are you are guilty.
Right.
So
Guilty of something. Right.
you're guilty, and that's a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
And another situation I had, which might have preceded this one, but it was real simple. I worked at a grocery store, and a guy came to rob the place, and it was a black dude, and he robbed it, and then he got away, and I was at gunpoint, and, you know, I didn't get shot. Everything was okay. And then, believe it or not, a few weeks later, he came and robbed the place again. But then I think it was after that, police brought down a suspect. Well, they didn't bring him down. They called us in to look at a suspect at the police headquarters, police station. And there was a guy, and they told us on the way this black guy he got into some kind of a little altercation with a policeman, and he didn't beat him up or something. And this guy, they thought he was the same guy that robbed the store, and they had us look at him and us line up. He says, "Is that him?" I said, No, that wasn't him." "Sure, it could have been him." "What?" "Yeah, it looks like him, don't it?" "No." "It could be him." I said, "No." "Sure, it could be him. He was acting up." "No, that's not him." "Sure, it is him." won't you say it's him? No, it's not him. Now, this guy that they had, evidently when he got into his altercation, he didn't have a weapon. But evidently, if he had been charged this other crime of robbing a grocery store with a gun, then the charge would have been far, far more serious.
Right. Yeah.
It teaches you that once you go downtown, because the system is the way it is, you might not be guilty of what they're saying, but they'll find you guilty of something, or at least treat you as though you're guilty of something. In other words, your life can be over very, 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 very fast. And I am just so thankful that things turned out that I didn't have to face any more serious incidents.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I would like to just throw in that to me was extremely important was that at this same grocery store, which I used to manage, there was a policeman, a Black policeman, who used to come through mainly in the evening, later on in the evening, and he would come in and I worked at night, most of the time, day to night, and he would be just kind of downtrodden. And we talked, and it turned out the policeman, he was a lieutenant, wasn't that same lieutenant I told you about before, but his name was Shelby Lanier.
Oh, I've interviewed him.
And it just so happened that we became like friends,
Mm-hmm.
And years later, and I was working at the Associated Press as just a clerk,
Mm-hmm.
and the Rodney King incident happened. Everyone was trying to get an interview with Shelby Lanier because he was chairman of the National Association of Black Police.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew Shelby because he used to stop in at that grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
Dairyland Food Mart was the name of it. And I contacted him about doing an interview, and he said, okay. And I was able to get an interview with Shelby Lanier, and nobody else, Courier Journal, or these. So
I'll throw in one thing, and I'm going to ask Reverend Barth a question, but I'll throw one thing about Shelby Lanier. When you're an oral historian, you can get interviews with him. I interviewed him in 1999 for my book on the Civil Rights Movement in Louisville. Did a life history interview with Mr. Lanier. It was great. I know I am very mindful of the time, Diana. I am paying attention to the time, but I do want to ask Reverend Barth, if you could just quickly, because one of the things that you talked about in yours is some of the protest activities and your own role in that. If you could just give us a taste of that.
Can I throw in one, because of that interview. In that interview, Shelby Lanier asked the president at the time to address that situation with Rodney King.
Uh-huh.
And the president did. And I think it was based upon that interview, which was published through the Associated Press.
I think that
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Reverend Barth?
So I would say my role in the protests was just as an attender. I didn't really have much anything in the way of leadership, but I guess maybe, I don't know, I would say about a week after the protest started at Jefferson Square, I simply went down there to Jefferson Square from where I live, just a little bit, just maybe three or 4 miles from there, just east of Louisville, and of downtown, and I went at a time when I thought not that much would be going on because I didn't know what it would be like, And so I parked and I walked to the square and I saw people just kind of preparing for a bigger march that was coming later in the day, and talked with a few people. And, just got the sense really of how people were mourning and how people were at the end of their rope in many ways, that here was yet another incident where an innocent person's life was taken very cavalierly. And then I did participate in one march that started there, and we walked, trying to remember, I can't quite remember, but we walked south of the square down to Broadway, I guess. And then I took part in one kind of supportive action from St. Peter's United Church of Christ that was actually organized by one of the Methodist churches. They were pretty much a white Methodist church. St. Peter's is pretty much an African-American church. But I'm a member, or I was a member there before I joined St. Luke's. And so I participated in that. We walked from St. Peter's to Jefferson Square, Brianna Square, Independence Square, and we held a communion service and offered communion to everyone. And then I went on the anniversary of her death. And I was walking with a group of clergy. So we gathered at the First Unitarian Church, which was very instrumental in helping people during the protest times. And we walked from there. And we were warned when we walked from there that we would probably see people with guns. And, I'm not sure which group that is. I can't remember now, but we saw standing right next to me was another white person in a flowered shirt with an AK or an AR-15 rifle. That was very confusing to me. It took me a long time to kind of put together there what was going on, or I'm still not sure that I've put together, what that was about. Somebody ready to do violence or thinking that they were helping to protect.
Yeah, it got kind of murky there, didn't it?
It got murky.
Yeah.
So that's been, I think maybe I went a couple of other times at sort of off times. Oh, I did go one Sunday morning when a protest was beginning. And there was another kind of church group across the way on the courthouse steps. And that was confusing. What people were, what was being prayed for or promoted. So I think that's pretty much been, so I guess I was there more than I realized. I think I went one other time too, just to say hello to people and offer encouragement. So,
even as you say that, it's actually prompts me to, I am moving towards a big evaluation question, but it prompts me, and both that and some of the stories that Mr. Basham just told, things that come up that maybe aren't quite clear yet, because we're doing, these interviews are being done in your case, sort of in the middle of this ongoing crisis. So there is still a lot of lack of clarity and sort of what happened. And one of the things that oral history does is sort of captures that moment, right? One I would like to sort of, as a wrap up type or evaluation type question, and I am, to some extent, I want to bring Diane and Eden back into the conversation, as people sort of seeing this whole project from the top, from the sort of the big picture. I'm always interested to hear, what did you think were either the key themes that came out of these interviews, key lessons, that these are the sort of, common themes or common ideas that go across them? Or maybe more interesting, perhaps, is, was there things that surprised you about the content of the interviews?
For me,
Well, I just like, well, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. Eden has
For
an
me,
example.
one of the things that came across all the interviews, most of the people that I interviewed are ones who, I'm not going to say they're resistant to change, but they think a long time about change. And they want to make sure that it is the right thing, that the change will improve their lives or do good. So they think about the change. Everyone I talked to made changes. And they saw other people making changes and not necessarily making changes that benefited them or society or the community, but everybody made a change of some type over the last 2 years that they did not anticipate making. So I think COVID became a change agent
Like an
for our
accelerator.
society. Not accelerator.
Mhm.
It was like a dominoes effect, that most of the time they were straight standing dominoes,
Mhm.
but some people who really thought, oh, COVID's just like the flu, came to realize that no, it's not, and they had to bend for survival, for personal survival. There are those I know, both in church and outside of church, who didn't get the vaccine, didn't believe it'd be more than the flu. And a number of them ended up with COVID with long-term effects. Some of them died. Some of them are financially really struggling now because they can no longer do jobs that they once did, or they took early retirement without actually planning for it. So it was a time of mass change that I don't think I've seen in people's way of thinking since my childhood.
Yeah. So I'm going to give Diane maybe the last word. Is that okay? Because I know we are going over time and you haven't had a chance to talk. And as the person who sort of came up with this and organized it, coordinated, did a lot of the work for it. What do you see as the sort of value in the stories that are coming out? I mean, what should people know about what you all learned from this?
Well, I think I'm not much of a talker, but
I'm going to make you talk.
but one thing that I saw that surprised me was that a lot of people seem to think that all this is a news story, and then I had, on the other hand, a lot of several people bringing back some of the older folks, how all of these are old stories. Just for instance, some of the folks that had longer memories mentioned remembering when their parents were afraid of polio, and I don't think there was anybody old enough that they really knew anybody with polio or tuberculosis, but those were things that
Mhm.
were knocked out in recent history. And so some folks were speaking about how this made them think, that COVID made them think about that. And also, every single person who I interviewed who was interviewed in the project who was Black talked about incidents like Larry has, when they have been discriminated against and frighteningly. And two different people mentioned the same shooting of a Black 19-year-old in 1959 in Jeffersonville by a rookie cop. And I never heard of that before. And I found a lot of information about the incident, and it really shaped these people who mentioned it were both teenagers then. This is somebody they knew who was killed, and it really shaped their perspectives. And it was in a lot of ways similar to what we've seen now, but but the response wasn't. The response was totally different. So that was really interesting and troubling, and
Mhm.
not sure what the future is going to make of it, but I
But so.
hope that the response,
Mhm.
that the fact that there was investigation this time, and that that it's not universally perceived as her fault, as Breonna Taylor's fault. She got shot, although I'm sure there are people that will say that. I mean,
Right. But I think one of the things that your
I hope
comment,
that means there's progress.
right. One of the things that your comment makes me think is sort of one of the beauties of oral history to me is the way that people tell their own story, embedding it in an older story, right? That sort of, the way people make those connections is to me as a historian really interesting. So are there any other final thoughts that anybody wants to share about the project or about their own experience?
I would just like to say that I believe that this project is extremely important, because a lot of times when you look back 20, 30, 40 years, 100 years about something important happening, it gives you more of an honest perspective on it, to hear what people felt like when it was going on,
Exactly.
rather than being romanticized in fiction or docudrama or whatever, to really know what it really felt like. And I really applaud that. And I think that some of the thing that it taught me was that whatever we learn, for example, remember when I told you my daughter called me up and told me, Daddy, this is serious, better get ready. Well, it just so happened with all the disinformation, when it came time to get the the vaccination, she wasn't going to get it, nor was my niece. So my big challenge then was to convince her and my niece to get vaccinated without, obviously I can't just tell them to do it; they won't do it. So I had to try to cajole them and sort of gently bring them around to accepting doing it, despite all the information. And the government was absolutely horrible, because one minute they'd say, "Oh, get masks." Next minute, not necessary. You don't have to get masks. Whatever. And I had to. I taught myself, yeah, I think it's best to go ahead and get them. I don't care what they say. And then with the vaccination, you need a vaccine. You don't need. And I had to try to convince my niece and my daughter to get it as soon as it's available. And that's what I did. And they did get it. And I'm so glad they did. And like I was saying just before we started recording, I just got diagnosed with it just a few days ago. But had I not had both my shots, both my boosters, I'm not so sure. I mean, I'm not saying it has been easy, but I'm not sure I would have been able to talk right now had I not had those shots in the booster, because who knows, things would have turned out in the end.
Right. And I think I'm gonna, go ahead, Karen.
I just wanted to say one thing that sort of brings the two, protest and the pandemic, together, and that was my other experience of being in the protests and at the square, where that people were very cognizant of wearing masks and keeping distance, and that was encouraging to me, that in the midst of that distress, people were taking care of each other in that way. It wasn't 100%, but it was a lot of people
Yes.
wearing masks and keeping distance.
Right. Yeah, I had that same experience. Well, I think that as Larry was speaking there, I thought, wow, what a great last word, which is that hopefully what this project does is enables historians in the future to get a sense of what it was like in the moment because of the nature of the interviews, right? Because they were people were being interviewed in the middle of the process. That this is like a nice a snapshot for the future, right? So thank you for doing the project, Diane. Very good. I think we're done.
Thank
That's it.
you all very
Yeah.
much. And Deb, our audience, I just wanted to apologize for leaving you in the waiting room. I'm sorry. The staff alerted me I'd left you there. So very, very sorry. And thank you all very much for coming. Thank you all for participating. And this will be recorded and available on our library's YouTube site within a few days, and I'll let you all know. Thank you very much. And you all have a
Thanks.
good evening. I'm going to end the recording now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Everybody have a good evening.